Thanks everybody for coming out to Phoenix Books in beautiful downtown Burlington on this sort of semi-spring-like but wintry day. And we're here tonight with Howard Coffin. He's not even really published his newest book. This book is supposed to come out next month, but because we are the most amazing bookstore ever, we got copies of it ahead of time. And so you can come and actually check out this book before anybody else in the whole world can see this book, which is pretty amazing in my book. Howard Coffin is a treasure, one of our treasured authors in Vermont, an expert on the Civil War, and especially how the Civil War impacted Vermonters in Vermont. He's written 5 other books, mostly about the Civil War. This book is really interesting because you can be in Vermont and still learn a lot and see a lot about what's happened in the Civil War in our history. Howard sort of comes by this genetically, I have to say. He has ancestors that served in the Civil War, and so I don't know if that interest was there from the very beginning or not, but you probably would think that it would be. And we're really excited to have him here, and please welcome Howard Coffin.
I'm looking at ghosts here tonight. I see ghosts from my past, my UVM days, my journalism days. Oh my goodness, my bus tours. My gracious, nice to see you all. And my wife Sue is in the front row. Oh, I even see a ghost from politics too. My wife Sue is in the front row. The book is dedicated to Sue and to the women of Vermont. Without the women of Vermont, Vermont could not have mounted a war effort that was probably on a per capita basis the most important among the northern states. And without Sue's help, I don't think this book would be finished now. And it took 6 years. So anyway, it's a great relief to have it done. And I had to come to Phoenix to find one. Nice to be here. More than 20 years ago, I went to Countryman Press in my hometown and with an idea for a book. I had done an article for Vermont Life magazine on 25 important Civil War sites in Vermont. And I thought after that I could do a book on Civil War sites in Vermont and tell the story of Vermont's Civil War history through sites. And I took it to Peter Jennison, one of the owners of Countryman. I'd never met him. We became close friends subsequently. I'm sorry he's no longer with us. And Peter heard me out over lunch and he said, Howard, you know what you really want to do but don't quite dare to do is write a history of Vermont in the Civil War. If you'll do that, we'll publish it. I did and they did. And so Full Duty came about and several books since that time, thanks to Peter Jennison, who once we agreed on subject and content, we became good friends, and he was a tremendous help. And so it was 6 years ago I began to research this book. I hope to do it in about 3 years, but I discovered a couple of things about seeking Civil War sites in Vermont. One is that don't try it in the winter. Many of them are covered up, or you can't get to them, or a lot of people that you need to see or houses you need to visit are closed up and there's nobody around. So that took out 4 to 5 months of the year, and the job was a much more difficult one than I thought. I had to go to every town in Vermont, and really I began a research project in each town because very few towns have any information on Civil War sites. Once people found out what I was doing, they were helpful, but the great frustration was that, for instance, in the town of Halifax, way down on the Massachusetts border, it was a 300-mile round trip from my house to Halifax. I went down for the first time, saw the town clerk, met with some local people, came home and wrote the Halifax chapter. The phone rang a week later, and a woman in Halifax had 2 more sites that I had to see. So back to Halifax I went, added those to the chapter, and the phone rang again. And another person in Halifax had 3 more sites, and down I went. So, you know, some towns I went to 3, 4, and sometimes 5 towns. A total of 150,000 miles on 3 cars. But at long last, finally, it is done. What I'm going to do tonight, briefly, is to go through the book a bit and just point out some of the sites that I think are more interesting, some of the ones that I found most fascinating. And I'm going to start not too far away in the town of Moncton. Right around 1800, a Quaker preacher named Joseph Hoag settled in Moncton, built himself a cabin, and cleared some fields. In 1806, according to a memoir that he published in 1846, just before he died, he was working his fields one October day, and he noticed that the sun had dimmed slightly. He stopped working and looked upwards, and he heard a voice from the heavens. And it spoke to him about its disappointment with what had happened in America since the settlers came and the wilderness was opened. The voice was very disgusted about some things that had happened, but particularly Southern slavery. And the voice predicted that there would be a bloody civil war over slavery. Now again, Hoag wrote this in 1846. He was dead 2 years later. So this voice that predicted the American Civil War, we know that it was heard well before any hint of civil war was coming along. The field is still cleared. Cows still graze there. The original house is gone, but the house that the Hoags built in the 1830s still stands by the field, and in it the Hoags gave refuge to fugitive slaves. It was an Underground Railroad house. And way down in the corner of the field where the Hoags are buried, there are two gravestones, one of a New York lad, one of a Vermont lad who served in the Civil War, and they both were Quakers going against their faith. It's a remarkable site, one of the best that I've found. Also in Moncton, about 4 miles south of this field, is a house with a cemetery beside it, the Morgan family home. A young soldier named, I'll get it here, Watson Morgan, 18 years old, went off to serve in the 6th Vermont Regiment, served for less than a year, and he was captured at the Weldon Railroad in 1864 near Petersburg, and he ended up in Andersonville prison. And he died in Andersonville. The body came home for a funeral in the house, and the young man was subsequently buried next door in the cemetery. His grave is on the highest point of the little cemetery, and the house is still in very good condition. The funeral was held in the house, and the body lay in the open casket, and it was, of course, after months in Andersonville, a human skeleton. An uncle of Private Morgan's, who was a minister, gave the sermon at the funeral. And what he said essentially was this: the South, most of their prisons are in the interior of the country, far from the seat of war, and where the prisoners might be fed if the disposition to feed them existed. Anyone knows that if a camp of 5,000 or 10,000 prisoners was located here in Vermont, small as our state is and rocky as our soil is, we could feed them. Georgia is several times as large, with mellow soil and sunny months and slaves to work. Still our captured patriots are denied bread enough to keep the skin upon their bones. It was an angry family that saw that son when he came home from Andersonville, where 40,000 Union prisoners were captives. The prison only was open for a year, and nearly 14,000 Union soldiers died there. Let's go to Arlington, Vermont, down in Bennington County, one of my favorite sites. Of course, 2 years before the Civil War began, John Brown, the abolitionist, who had a home in the Adirondacks over near Lake Placid, what we today call Lake Placid, and often came to Vermont for supplies, of course, staged a raid on the Union Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave revolt. Of course, he was captured, tried by the state of Virginia for treason against the state of Virginia, and on the 2nd of December he was hanged by a military detachment commanded by Robert E. Lee and James Ewell Brown Stewart. The day that he was hanged in Arlington, listen to this account from the book of a dear friend of mine, Robert Allen, who sadly passed away last year. December 2nd, 1859, in Arlington, Vermont, Almira Holly Canfield woke her grandson early in the morning. "Get up, Jim," she told him. "This is the day John Brown is to be hanged, and I want you to go over and toll the bell for him." Jim tolled the bell very slowly, as was the custom for a death, until relieved 2 hours later by his cousin. All day long the two boys alternated the task, and the tolling never stopped until nightfall. Meanwhile, across the street in our home, Mrs. Canfield sat in a straight rocking chair holding a Bible in her lap, from which she read aloud caustic passages from the Old Testament about God's plan for evildoers. Townspeople well understood Mrs. Canfield's outspoken views on abolition and slavery. Ever after that day, Jim Canfield said that he could still hear in the early morning the heart-shaking Day of Wrath knell solemnly filling with deep resonance our corner of the Vermont Valley. Now to Peacham, coming north. A bell in Peacham was tolled for 2 hours by an abolitionist in Peacham named Johnson on the day that John Brown was hanged. Perhaps more importantly about Peacham, as a result of the Lincoln movie, how many have seen Lincoln? Yeah, yes. I'm going again, incidentally. I don't think I got quite all of it. I came out of that movie and I turned to my wife after having seen it, and I said, "You know, that was not a movie about Lincoln. That was a movie about Thaddeus Stevens." And I have a fondness in my heart for Thaddeus Stevens because he is a native Vermonter and born in Danville and brought up in Peacham. He was the son of a widow, Sarah, whom he called Sally, who was apparently a saint of a woman who went about the countryside in Caledonia County taking care of the sick and dying. And Thaddeus, who was born crippled, went with her. And I'm absolutely convinced that by the time he left Vermont, he had a commitment to a humanist approach to life, to caring about people, to human freedom, because he was a poor boy and saw that people needed help, that manifested itself when he became a congressman and became the most powerful congressman during the Civil War. All the congressmen representing a district in Pennsylvania. And of course, Thaddeus Stevens, we really owe him for the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery in this country. In Peacham, the church still stands where the bell was tolled for Brown, where the Stevens attended church, and the house where Thaddeus Stevens lived while he attended Peacham Academy still stands. It's a mile from the Academy site. There's a monument on the side of the Academy. And every day, this club-footed boy walked a mile to and back from the Academy, and you can still follow the trace of that road that he walked. These places are fun to find. Guildhall, up along the Connecticut River in Essex County. Long before the Civil War, the local people cleared an area on top of Bear Mountain for a picnic spot. And that was the place to go on a Sunday afternoon in the summer for a lovely picnic, and you could see all across the Connecticut Valley and to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It's an extensive view. But it wasn't until the Civil War began that some people from Guildhall on top of Bear Mountain one day, looking down on the view, suddenly realized that the great loops and turns of the Connecticut River spelled the word Union. And it's stayed ever since. It's stayed ever since. Anyway, it's funny how history can change our perceptions. Island Pond in the town of Brighton, way up in the kingdom. In Island Pond, there was a widow lady named Stevens. Let me find this section. Samantha Stevens was the parents of 3 Civil War soldiers. Samantha Stevens had lost her husband before the Civil War began, and she had 3 strapping boys who helped her on the farm, which is at the southern end of Island Pond. But when the war began, all the boys wanted to go off and fight, and Samantha walked the 3 miles from her house to the railroad station in Island Pond to put them on the train. And that was the last she saw of 2 of them. Orlando joined the 3rd Vermont D Company, was soon dead of rebel bullets at Lee's Mill at age 20. Russell served until he was killed on July 1864 at Fort Stevens near Washington. That's the day that the Vermonters helped to save Washington from capture by Jubal Early's Confederate Army. A 3rd son, Calvin, Company D of the 4th Vermont, came home and was an invalid for the rest of his life. While the boys were away, Samantha, all by herself, built a new house so that they'd have it to come home to, but of course only one son came home. The house still stands in very nice condition, and you can trace the path that she walked to the town with her sons. But then every night, at least once a week throughout the rest of the war, to join the ladies of Island Pond, sewing to make things for the soldiers, cooking food to send in boxes to the soldiers. The house is still there. It's a magnificent sight. And all 3 boys are buried beside a mother in the old Protestant cemetery at Island Pond. West Fairleigh over in Orange County. The most famous person who ever lived in West Fairleigh was Stephen Thomas, who commanded the 8th Vermont Regiment and led it at Cedar Creek and Winchester. At Winchester, an important Union victory, he got his 8th Vermont moving, and hence the whole Union battle line moving, with the words, if you ever pray, pray now. Remember old Vermont and we'll drive them to hell. Come on, old Vermont. And Winchester was a victory. And then at Cedar Creek, Thomas's little 8th Vermont Regiment made a suicidal stand against this sudden surprise attack in the morning by the Confederates under Jubal Early, losing 67% of their men, the 7th highest regimental loss percentage-wise in all of the Civil War. You can still see the footprint of Thomas's house in the village of West Fairleigh. But there's a house nearby where lived the owner of the copper mines in West Fairleigh. And about 5 years after the Civil War ended, the miners went on strike. And they marched from the copper mines to the house of this man to demand more pay, and they wanted it that day. Now, I'm a union man, and I'm not totally in support of what Thomas did that day. But what he did do, he went to the home of the mine owner, who was in bed and supposedly sick. And Thomas went up the stairs and stood at the top of the stairs by his bedroom door with 2 pistols drawn, and the miners did not come up the stairs. Thomas promised them that they'd get their additional pay, and they did. But seeing Thomas there with those 2 pistols, there must have been a reminder of what he had done at Cedar Creek, standing there with his men and turning back the Confederates. Both the Thomas house is a footprint. The mine owner's house still stands. And 3 miles down the road, a remarkable Civil War site where a local woman operated through the Civil War a knitting factory, mostly making mittens. She shipped the wool in from Boston, parceled it out to local women who worked in their homes. They brought the mittens back. She shipped them to Boston and paid them. And this kept many local families going during the Civil War when the able-bodied men were off at war. Now to Craftsbury. We'll go north to Craftsbury. You know, you wander this state as long as I did, looking for these sites, and it can get a little bit routine. But then every once in a while you come on a site that grabs you. That happened to me in Craftsbury, where a local man showed me this site. Turn left on North Craftsbury Road, quickly cross the Black River and reach the top of a knoll, and a small turnoff is on the right. From here, look right to where a tall tree stands above the river. The Boutwell home once was there, and the Boutwell family worked these fertile fields and swam in the winding river. Then came the war, and 4 sons, Rodney, Robert, William, and Thomas, enlisted. Rodney joined the 11th Vermont as a private in July 1862. At Cold Harbor, he was shot through both hips and died 5 days later at age 22. Robert, a private in the 14th Vermont, was shot through the knee at Spotsylvania's Bloody Angle. Next day, his leg was cut off at the field hospital, and he died from the effects of chloroform. William went to New Hampshire to enlist in the state's 16th Regiment, but died in 1863 of sickness in Louisiana. Thomas joined the 4th Vermont as a private in September 1861, but was home in 3 months, disabled for life by disease. Basically, that family lost all 4 sons. And to stand there today and look at that house site, you can't even find a trace of a cellar hole, but thankfully a local man showed me that tree stands right where the house stood. You walk out in that field, and it's a beautiful green place in the summer, and just down over the bank, the river makes a turn, so it's a nice, gentle current. You knew those kids swam in that river, worked in those hay fields. It was a sad place to be. Something seemed to abide. Let's go down to Brattleboro. Brattleboro's filled with Civil War history. There are sites and sites and sites to see. Let me just touch on one. Brattleboro's main street. Many buildings still stand that stood during the Civil War, and Brattleboro was the most active town militarily during the Civil War. The big drill field was there where the regiments assembled and went off to war. There was a big Civil War hospital in Brattleboro, active throughout the war. The 4th Vermont gathered at Brattleboro, and the day before they left for the war zone in 1861 in September, they paraded through the streets of Brattleboro, and some local person, we don't know who it was, wrote a poem that the Reformer published on page 1. I'm going to read it. It'll only take a second here. But it's a little rough, but see if it doesn't get at what had to be the mood, the sadness of that day. Slowly through the misty street comes the measured tramp of feet, and 1,000 forms sweep by, going forth to win or die. Waving colors o'er their head, blue and white with bars of red, proudly greet the evening sky. O'er their hearts that beat so high, oh, their hearts that beat so high, stepping to the roll of drum, down the darkening street they come, ready each to bear his part, to resign it may be life, eager to but join the strife. Cheers, oh cheers, rise to the sky. Barely comes their last goodbye. Though the aching heart be weak, trembling lips are forced to speak. Leaving they for years and coming years, children's sobs and women's tears, sadly here to watch and wait for the footfall at the gate, for the step upon the floor that may come perchance no more. Will they tread the homeward track? God in mercy bring them back. Wow, that's a good last line, isn't it? Brattleboro, well worth a trip. There's a house in Brattleboro on a back street that still stands, built about 1830, where a family named Brown lived. In 1858, they had a guest for a week, Henry David Thoreau. He joined the Browns, who were botanists, in exploring the hills around Brattleboro, looking for rare plants, and met this Brown's son who went with them. When Thoreau returned to Massachusetts, he wrote in his journal that from the conversations that he had had in Brattleboro, he was absolutely certain that a civil war was about to begin in this country, and it would be horrible. In 1863, the Brown's son was killed at Shiloh. Now to Richmond, Vermont, just down the road. This is one of my favorite sites, and I discovered this late in my research through an article I found in an old Burlington Free Press candy page. All throughout Vermont, when word came of the fall of Richmond in 1865, April 3rd, there were celebrations. The church bells rang, torches were lit, muskets were fired off, parades were held, the local band came out. But the biggest one of all was held in Richmond, Vermont. Everybody went to Richmond because the name of Richmond was Richmond, and they could celebrate there the fall of the Confederate capital. I just think that's wonderful. Now I will conclude here by just going down to Brandon before I take any questions you may have. We'll go down to Brandon in Rutland County, which is incredibly rich with Civil War places. Incidentally, there are about 2,500 in here, so there's a lot of looking for all of you. You can have the same experience I had. Thank God you don't have to go back time and time again. Find these places. In Brandon was a hotbed of abolitionism. Of course, Stephen Douglas was born there, who was Lincoln's political rival. Lincoln lost to him in the Senate race in Illinois and then beat him for the presidency. Vermont only voted 6-1 for Lincoln over our native son, of course. His house still stands. It's now a very nice museum. That's not the reason I want to call your attention to Brandon here today. It concerns the dedication of the Brandon Civil War Memorial many years after the war. See if I can find the date. Not that it matters that much, but yes. Memorial Day, 1886. The Brandon Civil War Memorial is dedicated, and it's a great soaring monument. It's a granite monument with a stone soldier on top. It's rather lovely. And it stands on the triangle in the middle of the village of Brandon. 7,000 people came to the dedication that day, and the featured speaker was Lewis Addison Grant, who commanded the Vermont Brigade longer than any other commander and through most of the major battles. He was the commander through the Overland Campaign, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Lewis Addison Grant, he's an interesting man. The men in the beginning didn't like him very well. Apparently he was one of those commanders who was a little bit picky, you know. He was a stickler about, you know, dress and polish and things like that. And the men developed a nickname for Grant. The rest of the Army called him the other Grant, you know. But the Vermont Brigade men called him Aunt Lydia. Aunt Lydia. Well, why in hell did they call him Aunt Lydia? You know, I always thought, well, you know, maybe he was a little old lady-ish or something, you know. One day I was in an antique shop in Quechee, Vermont, and I looked up on the shelf, and there was a box up there of sewing, of sewing equipment. Aunt Lydia's sewing equipment. And the picture of Aunt Lydia on the box just looked just like Lewis Addison Grant. So I know now, you know. But he was, in all things considered, he's a good commander, and his big moment comes on April 2nd, 1865, when he spots a weakness in the Confederate lines at Petersburg and tells the other Grant about it, Ulysses Grant about it, and the attack that's launched against that weakness broke the Confederate lines at Petersburg with the Vermonters leading the charge, and Lee surrenders a week later at Appomattox. So he had his big day. Well, he comes back to Brandon to speak, and he's now Assistant Secretary of War. He's gone places, although he did move to Iowa afterwards. He comes home. And what did he say that day at Brandon? He talked, incidentally, for about an hour. I will not burden you with all of that, but near the conclusion, Grant was saluted by tremendous cheers which burst forth afresh at different times throughout the eloquent address. Near the conclusion, he said, "The war tore the manacles of bondage from millions of people and bade them go free. It raised them in the eyes of the law from the condition of chattels to that of free men. It lifted them from degradation and slavery to citizenship and sovereignty." And then he addressed the parents of those who had died. "Dear friends, father, and loving mother, the sacrifice of your loving son has produced glorious results. Their blood, mingled with the blood of thousands and tens of thousands of sons and brothers, has made the atoning sacrifice, and this great crime against Christianity and the age has been washed away, and you live to see your nation rising in newness and life, not yet perfect, not yet what it shall be, but better and pure, while undergoing the great work of regeneration." And then he spoke of the brigade he had commanded, the 1st Vermont Brigade, the Old Brigade, as the boys called it. "My feeling toward the soldiers of that brigade is akin to brotherly love. We have helped to guide our nation into the paths of peace. Let us labor to hasten on the glorious day when peace shall prevail and nations shall learn war no more. That day is coming. It shall be a day of rejoicing, the like of which has not been known since when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy." Wow. Lewis Addison Grant, Aunt Lydia. I'm finished talking, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Incidentally, you will find in this book that every site listed, and there's a tremendous variety, the directions are there to find them. And don't go in winter. Be prepared for some rough roads and for some long drives, but I think you'll find it's well worth it. And you'll find that people are very accommodating, at least the people that I met and helped me are very accommodating. And one more point I should make is that I discovered that I did this book just in time, because there are a lot of people in this state who know something about Civil War history are very elderly. Or I would walk into a town clerk's office and ask about people who knew local history, and the reply too often was, "Oh, she just passed away last week or last month, you know. It's getting late." Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Did you find a Civil War site
Did I find a Civil War site in every town? Pardon? I did repeat the question. Yes, I did. A very honest answer to that, Candy, would be no. But every town has a chapter, although a couple of towns are combined. Rutland and Rutland Town are combined. Burlington and South Burlington are combined. Virtually nothing in South Burlington that I could find, except that little cemetery out by the airport, where there's an important Civil War soldier buried. So I combined them. In the town of Lewis, which has no year-round inhabitants, it's 14 miles from the main road to drive into Lewis. All I could say about Lewis was that no one was living in Lewis at the time of the Civil War either. There were some lumbering operations, and certainly before and after the Civil War, some Civil War soldiers were involved in the lumbering operation. That's all I could find. Incidentally, the day that I drove into Lewis, I'd never been to Lewis, and this made it 251 for me. Driving into Lewis, 14 miles on this very rough road. Irene hadn't helped, of course. I made my way, and the local ranger told me that when you get to the edge of the pond, that's Lewis Pond, and you're in Lewis. Well, the road petered out, and I got out, and I walked. I could see the pond in the distance, and I walked along the track, and it got narrower and narrower, and then suddenly there was a Jeep around the corner. So I knew I wasn't alone, but I kept on walking, and suddenly it opened out, and there was a very tiny beach, and looking at me from the middle of the pond was a moose, and on the beach was a couple stark naked. So I went, which scared the moose. Anyway, so, really, Lewis I didn't find up, and Ferdinand I found, I think, one logger boarding house close by the site of a soldier's home, and there was a belief, I think, that the soldier probably, after the war, had boarded at that house. It was really shaky there, really shaky. But most towns, I've got at least something. Yes, sir.
I have a book on the Civil War that's signed by William Wells. It must have been his book.
Yes.
And you have him living up on South Willard Street.
Yes.
And in here it says the former commander of the Vermont Cavalry.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could tell me a little about him, or is that name?
Oh, sure.
Expert, so.
Oh, sure. The question concerns William Wells, who, incidentally, he was born in Waterbury. His house, the house he was born in, doesn't actually exist, but it burned a few years ago and was rebuilt exactly as it was. So you think it's there. He grew up in Waterbury and went to war from Waterbury, and the Vermont Historical Society has his letters home to his parents, and they're written to that house in Waterbury. He joins the cavalry. He rises through the ranks all the way from private to colonel, commanding the first Vermont cavalry. He's a very, very good cavalry commander, and leads the Vermonters in two of their important charges. The charge at Cedar Creek under George Custer, and the charge at Gettysburg under Judson Kilpatrick was a horrible mistake. Never should have been made. It was a suicidal charge, but Wells followed orders, did as he was told, and he compiled a very good record. His statue is down in Battery Park today. It's a fine statue, and a replica of it is on the battlefield at Gettysburg, where the Vermonters began their charge in the shadow of Little Round Top. Incidentally, Battery Park is a very good Civil War site, not only because of Wells, but the 13th Vermont Regiment drilled there before they went to war, and they led the attack, the Vermont attack on Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So they were drilling. Wells did live up in that big house. He made a lot of money after the war in business here in Burlington. The Wells-Richardson building is his.
He was an intimate of Grant's, too. He seemed to move very high up the
Yeah.
ranks, and he was in Washington. And I just wanted to say, one of my favorite Vermont towns, Athens, in here, the meeting house there.
Yes.
If anyone's ever been to that little town, can you talk a little about Athens?
I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
I'll have to refresh my memory here.
People even know there's an Athens, Vermont.
The question here is, concerns the town of Athens. It is in Windham County. It's kind of in northwestern Windham County. Let's see.
Saxons River, basically.
Yes.
Bellows Falls.
I'll just read a bit of the chapter on Athens. And by the way, this book gets not only at the war years, but about the pre-war years, the approach of the war, the Underground Railroad, and abolitionism, and then it concerns sites dealing with war memories and the aftermath of the war, right up until the last soldier died in 1944. Athens, a half mile past the Oaks House, is Valley Cemetery, where several Athens soldiers are buried, including Privates Powers and Oakes. According to the local Wyman book, the first memorial decoration of soldiers' graves in Athens was in the summer of 1784 and was directed by Miss Mina Carter, the teacher at the South Brick School. She, in sympathy with the growing spirit of the times to honor the memory of our soldiers, prepared her school with appropriate exercises, and they marched to the cemetery where Uncle Elisha Edwards offered prayer and raised the flag, while a little group of teacher and scholars sang America and placed around the flag their tokens of honor and respect for fallen heroes. According to the man Wyman who wrote the local book, of the 40-odd men who went to war, few returned to take up their broken threads of life in their new hometown. Many were caught in the new tide of Western migration. They bade farewell to the small fields and cold climate of their Vermont homes, often reluctantly, nevertheless irresistibly drawn to new frontiers. 11 men did return to Athens to live and finally to be laid to rest in Athens cemeteries. That's an important point about Vermont right there. Of the 44 men who went to war from Athens, only 11 came back and stayed. Vermont lost a lot of population right after the Civil War because the soldiers had seen warmer climates, more level fields without stones, greener pastures is what it was, and there was no old man to tell them what to do. Hugely important, that factor. Yeah, they got out. Anyone else?
Howard, you mentioned that
Yeah.
your own personal family goes back
Yeah.
in Civil War. Are there grave sites or memorials or of any sort that are personal to you in that sense?
Oh, yes. I had 6 ancestors in Vermont regiments in the Civil War. One of them, David Moody Gilson, was in the 4th Vermont and was wounded 3 times. Years ago, I was researching my latest book, the book before this, on the Civil War, The Battered Stars, which was about Grant's overland campaign. And I was reading a soldier letter about being in the trenches at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and the soldier is writing to his mother about what it's like in the trenches, and all of a sudden he interrupts the sentence to say, "Oops, Gilson just got hit." That's my great-great-uncle. The only reference I ever found to him in his Civil War letters are gone, but there it was. He got hit. He got hit at Spotsylvania. He got hit at 3rd Winchester, and then he was horribly wounded on April 2nd, 1865, at the breakthrough at Petersburg. He came home to his sister's house in South Pomfret and died the night after Christmas. He never was well, and the cemetery, they took him back to Williamstown, where he grew up, to bury him. The house he died in is still there. My great-grandfather Gilson served in the 9th Vermont Regiment for just 1 year. He only fought in 1 battle. He was a private. Not much of a war record, although he did march into Richmond. He died in 1923 on a snowy winter night. And the next morning, the men from the town, 300 people from the town, came to shovel 3 miles of road so his casket could be borne to this Grange Hall in South Pomfret so he could lie in state. Imagine still in 1923, the people held their minor Civil War soldiers in that great regard. And then there's a gravestone in West Rochester of a man named James Crossman, who was killed at Cedar Creek. He was my mother's great-great uncle. Incidentally, he appears in this wonderful play that has been produced in Rochester and is going to begin in Montpelier at the end of this month, called Ransom. Lost Nation Theater is doing it in Montpelier. Go and see it. The Rochester, the Valley Players did it. I went to see that 2 years ago. The play is so good, when asked for my opinion, I said it should be at Ford's Theater. It's not only drama, it's music, and it tells better than anything I've yet seen the story of the home front. Not only the hardships and the stories of the wounded coming home and the letters coming home, but the jealousies at home and the angers and the petty jealousies and the competition about whose son's doing what and so forth. It's a magnificent play. It'll grab you. I think the whole audience, including yours truly, was weeping. I don't cry that easy. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Howard, when did you say the last Vermont veteran died?
He died in 1944. His name was Gilbert Lucier. He lived in Jay, Vermont. He had served in the 11th Vermont Regiment. They were an artillery outfit when they were sent south. And in the beginning of the war, they manned the forts protecting Washington. One day when they were working on the forts, Abraham Lincoln came by and Lucier shook his hand. Lucier later was wounded at Cold Harbor, but he came home safely. And he lived way into his 90s. He and his nephew went to the 75th anniversary of Gettysburg, went to Gettysburg. And they were in a tent there. And they were there several days. And one night the nephew went out on his own and came back, and Gilbert asked him where he'd been. And the nephew said that he had been over across the road visiting some of the Confederates. And Gilbert Lucier said, "Pack your bag, we're going home." He hated those Confederates, and he still did. Yes, I knew his great niece, Peg Berry, down in Brattleboro, and she saw him several days before he died in the hospital up at Newport, and he still had his blue uniform beside his bed.
He must have been pretty young when he went to serve.
I think he was 18. I think he was 18, yes. I'll tell you just one more quick story about him. I spoke one morning at 7 o'clock in one morning at a Rotary Club in the Mad River Valley on the Civil War. I don't remember what I said. I'm not a morning person. But at the end of the talk, I mentioned Gilbert Lucier. And a man in the back of the crowd, a very elderly man, got up and said, "I knew Gilbert Lucier." I said, "No." He said, "Yeah, he was my next door neighbor when I was a little boy." I said, "Did you ever shake his hand?" He said, "Oh, yes, many times." I said, "Come up here." And I shook the guy's hand, and I said, "There, I just shook the hand of a man who shook the hand of a man who shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln." That was 7 years ago. I haven't washed my hands since. Anyway, yes, sir.
Mr. Coffin, I'd just like to say this book is incredible, and you've added so much to Vermont history, and I really want to thank you. And I know everyone feels it's just you added so much, and you are the authority on this. I just want to thank you.
Well, I appreciate those words. I will tell you something, and if any of you, and I hope you'll make some use of this book. I hope you'll spend some afternoons wandering around and finding these places. But when you go forth and you find mistakes in the book, because they're there. I never had a chance to go back over all the directions, check all the directions, so there's going to be mistakes. Call me, contact me. My addresses are in the book, and let me know for the second edition, because I want to get the mistakes out of there. And I know they're there. I just know it. But anyway, it was a big project, and I got older and tired. Thank you very much for those words. And I'm happy to sign some books now. Thank you.